Здравствуйте! Меня зовут Михаил Кирш. Приветствую участников конференции от имени Комитета политических действий Ларуша. To have post-crisis development of the world economy, it is necessary to end the crisis. Which crisis are we talking about? Speaking to a Russian audience, the American economist Lyndon Larush said, "We are in the end phase of the IMF system, as it has existed since U.S. President Nixon's introduction of a so-called floating exchange rate monetary order in August 1971. Nothing can save the present world financial and monetary system in its present form. A continued refusal to accept certain necessary, sweeping reforms would bring about not only an economic catastrophe worse than the 1930s economic depression. The present crisis, unless stopped by drastically needed reforms, will also be a demographic collapse, more or less comparable to what is called by historians the New Dark Age, which dominated Europe following the 14th century bankruptcy of the so-called Lombard banking system." Therefore, to speak of any economic policy which does not include an early and sweeping reform of the IMF system is worse than a waste of time. Larush spoke those words in June 2001, 6 years before the time when many people believed the crisis started in 2007. And on the eve of the dramatic 2007 events, when derivatives contracts linked to the U.S. real estate bubble imploded, Larush again warned that the crisis is not cyclical. It is systemic.
There is no possibility of a non-collapse of the present financial system. None. It's finished now. The present financial system cannot continue to exist under any circumstances, under any presidency, under any leadership, or any leadership of nations. Only a fundamental and sudden change in the world monetary financial system will prevent a general, immediate, chain reaction type of collapse. At what speed, we don't know, but it will go on, and it will be unstoppable. And the longer it goes on, before coming to an end, the worse things will get.
Debates about a second wave of the crisis are meaningless because they are based on a mistaken belief that the first wave occurred in 2007 to 2009. In reality, the events since 2007 up through this year's U.S. and Eurozone debt crisis are the latest inflection points in a long arc of crisis since the crucial political decision in 1971 to terminate the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system and launch the biggest speculative bubble in history. Larush talked about that bubble at a Moscow seminar on Russia, the USA, and the global financial crisis in April 1996. He said, "We are in the middle of the worst international monetary and financial crisis of this century. The financial crisis has two dimensions: its severity and the efforts of many leading institutions in the world to pretend it doesn't exist. The continuous crisis process after 1971 has included the savings bank and leveraged buyout crisis of the 1970s and 80s, the 1987 stock market crash, the currency collapses and government bond defaults in Asia and Russia in 1997 and 1998, caused by hedge fund speculation, and the gigantic expansion of derivatives operations in the 2000s, leading to the so-called subprime mortgage collapse of 2007 to 2008. Larush explained at the 1996 roundtable, "There has been a decoupling of monetary processes from physical productive policies. One set of figures from the United States illustrates that most dramatically. From 1956 through 1970, the total U.S. foreign exchange turnover per year, 75% was accounted for by merchandise trade, exports, and imports. In 1976, this had fallen to 23%. In 1982, this had fallen to 5%. In 1992, to 2%. Recently, it's less than 0.5%. That is, before 1971, the majority of international currency transactions were associated with the movement of physical goods. After 1971, that portion rapidly fell, down to 0.5%. The other 99.5% became purely speculative operations, even without considering the nominal value of potential claims in the form of derivatives contracts. Now, the infinite bailouts and quantitative easing of 2008 to 2011 have boosted the post-1971 global bubble into the quadrillions of US dollars of unpayable obligations. Speaking at the State Duma in June 1995, Larush compared this hyperinflationary process to a malignant tumor. The global monetary system is like the final stage of an incurable cancer. The tumor is very large. As it grows, its appetite grows too, and the victim becomes weaker. The cancer cells live by eating the victim. If the process isn't stopped, the victim dies. And when the victim dies, the malignant tumor starves to death. Russian anti-drug chief Viktor Ivanov depicted the destructive force of the financial bubble in the same terms when he addressed an audience in Washington, D.C. on November 18, 2011. Today's Eurozone debt bailout packages are coupled with murderous austerity against the populations of Ireland, Greece, Italy, and ultimately all the EU countries. There is no limit to the hyperinflationary bailout schemes of the City of London, its junior partners on Wall Street, and the offshore hedge funds. After all, U.S. Fed Chairman Bernanke has said that they would drop money from helicopters, if necessary, in an attempt to bail out the markets and the investment banks. This system generates billionaires, while the very existence of billions of people is threatened. It is no surprise that a London and EU ideologue, such as Hans-Joachim Schellenhuber, says that the population of the Earth should be reduced from 7 billion people to 1 billion people. This imperial system of financial looting also generates threats to launch world war, especially as the system's general bankruptcy becomes more and more obvious. Currently, strategists within the monetary system are apparently determined to respond to the impending collapse of the transatlantic banking system with a war against Iran and Syria, and ultimately, Russia and China. The perverse assumption behind such an undertaking is that it were better to maintain control over a destroyed world after a war than to watch the Atlantic region collapse, while the large Asian nations with high growth rates develop and assert themselves, becoming the world's leading economic powers. Therefore, a serious post-crisis policy must first end the crisis by ending the monstrous policies which generate the crisis and which threaten to generate war and mass deaths worldwide. At the State Duma in 1995, Lyndon Larush said, "I believe that the alternative I propose will find support in your country and probably China and some other countries. My alternative is to use the authority and the power of the governments to declare the global central banking system bankrupt and organize a new international credit banking system in order to revive industry, agriculture, and so forth." When we talk about the American system, people often mistakenly think that it means the Federal Reserve System and its electronic money printing presses. It doesn't. An American system national bank is not the same as today's global system of central banks of the Anglo-Venetian type, such as the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, and including the U.S. Fed. Money is not value, and a credit system to promote physical economic development is not a printing press to bail out speculators. Here is what Lyndon Larush says about reinstituting of a credit system today.
We're going back to the principles on which this nation was founded. the principles of a credit system. Now, the situation is this. We are so bankrupt as a nation that no ordinary course of action under the present rules of behavior will save this nation from self-destruction in the immediate future. We're about to be obliterated if we continue on the present course. Not only Obama obviously must be removed from power. In the meantime, his making him impotent in power will mean that other people in our government will be able to move with the Glass-Steagall Act. Now, the Glass-Steagall Act itself will not save the nation. The Glass-Steagall Act is necessary as a part of the steps to be taken to rescue this nation from absolute bankruptcy. But it by itself will not save the nation. For example, we cannot use a normal form of reform of the monetary system of the United States. The situation is too bad and too urgent. Therefore, we're going to have to go from the kind of monetary system we had, not a monetarist system, but the monetary system we had at former times, as in Roosevelt's time, to do something Roosevelt had not really attempted to do explicitly. And that is to put the nation back under the provision of its original Constitution to function as a credit system rather than a money system. There's not enough money that we can create legally and prudently to save this nation. We've gone too far, too long, especially since 2007. Therefore, we're going to have to go to what is enshrined in our original federal Constitution, to a credit system. In other words, the federal government will, under law, instead of a money system, will have a credit system. And the credit system will be used not only to get the police, the firemen, and other essential state-level people back into employment, to get federal institutions which are needed back into employment and functioning. But we're going to have to go beyond that. We're going to require a very large and powerful driver for a genuine economic recovery of not only the United States, but also of nations which are friendly, shall we say, or will become friendly to the United States. What we're going to do is tell them to join us in a reform of monetary systems of the like, which will enable Europe to follow the same course that we are following. We will create a joint credit system. What we will do with Europe, in cooperation with Europe and with Russia and with China and with India and so forth, what we will do is establish a kind of credit system which will be universal among these nations. We will go to credit as a way of investing in a buildup of the productive powers of labor throughout that region.
What is a genuine credit system? What is it that was enshrined in the U.S. Constitution? 120 years ago, the concept was well known as the American system of Alexander Hamilton and Henry Carey, or the national economy concept of Friedrich List and of Count Witte and the fervent anti-free trader Dmitry Mendeleev. But their ideas have been expunged from economics today. Let us show a part of the history of the American credit system concept through this video produced by the Larush Political Action Committee. We designed it to educate members of our Congress, most of whom are ignorant of these fundamental American principles. Today's historians are incompetent because they don't understand the difference between Adam Smith's feudal Europe, where private banks had arbitrarily given value to money, holding the sovereignty of nations hostage to the amount of this money they have or go into debt to private banks to have, on the one side, and on the other, Alexander Hamilton's revolutionary hypothesis of 1779 to 1781, a system where governments have no need of going into debt to private banks or praying to the market to create the money upon which the nation subsists. Whether this difference is understood will determine whether civilization will survive the current global breakdown crisis of the world economy. Understanding this difference lies in the lesson of the contrast of 1776, when independent colonies were only free in name and not in fact, versus Hamilton's vision of 1779 to 1781 of a government fully capable of carrying out the mission of the stated intent of the Declaration. To begin, I'd like to quote directly from his Federalist paper, number 31, written on New Year's Day, 1788. A government ought to contain in itself every power requisite to the full accomplishment of the objects committed to its care, and to the complete execution of the trusts for which it is responsible, free from every other control but a regard to the public good and the sense of the people. As the duties of superintending the national defense and of securing the public peace against foreign or domestic violence involve a provision for casualties and dangers to which no possible limits can be assigned, the power of making that provision ought to know no other bounds than the exigencies of the nation and the resources of the community. As revenue is the essential engine by which the means of answering the national exigencies must be procured, the power of procuring that article in its full extent must necessarily be comprehended in that of providing for those exigencies. Hamilton proceeded from his stance of taking the destiny of a people out of the foreign will of the British Isles, which since the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763 had rose to a full empire, and had more and more bent toward using Adam Smith's invisible hand as the method of subduing colonies to give up their own economic sovereignty by accepting the external authority of free markets, independent from regulation by governments, and the money to be used in exchange in those free markets as having self-evident value outside of the existence of the nations involved. In 1779, in the middle of the war, as Washington's aide-de-camp coordinating all of the exigencies for the army, Hamilton realized that there was no possible way the motley of disunified states, which could barely be made to support the Continental Congress, were going to exist after the war. The powers necessary for a federal government that could unify the states lay within the realm of economic sovereignty and would define the difference between a sovereign credit system of a nation-state and those states which are plagued by external monetary authorities. Hamilton began writing letters from the battle tent to leading members of the Continental Congress and financiers of the reasons for the credit of the nation being lost, and remarked in one of these letters that the Continental Congress had lost the spirit of 1776, meaning that although they had then declared themselves as free and independent states, having the power to establish commerce, conclude peace, levy war, and all other acts and things which independent states may of right do, they were not using those implied powers in order to achieve it. Mainly, they were not carrying out those powers with respect to their finances, even though such action was necessary for true independence. As the central coordinator for Washington during the war, Hamilton rose to take full responsibility for the nation, and in April 1781, Hamilton wrote a long essay to the leading financier of the Continental Congress, Robert Morris. It is by introducing order into our finances, by restoring public credit, not by winning battles, that we are finally to gain our object. Hamilton wrote to Morris with a way to outflank the problem of the collapsing value and increasing scarcity of the continental paper currency, a way to support the Continental Congress with enough funds, despite the unruly and bankrupt condition of the states. Rather than depending on individual loans from abroad, private individuals, or scarce taxes, which no matter how fast they were gathered, were spent even faster, the way the government could secure a permanent paper credit was to construct a national bank.
It would promote commerce by furnishing a more extensive medium which we greatly want in our circumstances. I mean a more extensive valuable medium. The tendency of the national bank is to increase public and private credit. Industry is increased, commodities are multiplied, agriculture and manufacturers flourish, and herein consists the true wealth and prosperity of the state.
By converting the currency produced through loans of the bank into a real and successful instrument of trade, it would increase the quantity and strength of the currency. Morris and his associates in the Continental Congress were convinced, and the Congress chartered the Bank of North America that year, a bank whose sole reason for existence was to facilitate the development of a national economy. Rather than obtaining individual loans for each of its purposes and extracting donations from the states, the initial capital which formed the bank would put the nation as a whole, rather than the states, in debt. Therefore, the new national debt served to unify the nation for the first time and bring the debts under the responsibility of Congress, thus transforming the meaning of debt altogether.
A national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. It will be a powerful cement of our union.
By this new bank serving as a tool of the Continental Congress, Hamilton transformed the United States from a monetary system into a credit system. Almost. Because this campaign had only won its first battle in 1781. Under the 1780 Articles of Confederation, the Continental Congress did not have the power to organize a national economy. They couldn't bring the resources of the different states into one unified process. They didn't have the power to organize a national system of taxation or the power to regulate trade. As stated, the means by which the Congress was to enact its power bestowed in it by the Declaration of Independence to provide for the exigencies of the nation were not in proportion with that power. Therefore, the federal government effectively had no lasting credit. In this way, although the Bank of North America salvaged the nation's credit for the time being and ensured the ability to win the Revolutionary War, the federal government could not effectively supply the national bank for the purpose it was established. Therefore, in identifying the deeper roots of the problem, Hamilton began organizing a broader audience for a national government with sufficient powers. Typified by his open letters from Fishkill, New York, named the Continentalist Papers, which would prove to define all the economic principles of government, principles which would later become the cornerstones of the Annapolis and Constitutional Conventions. Hamilton took responsibility to combat the ignorance of the importance and method of carrying out the powers he'd instilled in that Constitution to secure the credit system, best exemplified by Federalists 30 through 36 for the power of taxation. In 1790, as Secretary of Treasury in the Washington administration, Hamilton could then initiate the powers he'd outlined in Article 1, Section 8. By means of the powers to pay the debts, provide for the common defense and general welfare, lay and collect taxes, regulate commerce, the federal government could now ensure the power of its credit. Hamilton first assumed all the debts of the states incurred during the war into a national debt, which served as a driver to initiate the powers of government. And second, since the Bank of North America was insufficient for the task, he established a new national bank, housing the national debt. Hamilton rigorously showed the national bank which he had set up before the Constitution to be the necessary and constitutional mean for carrying out the powers of Congress. The authority of the United States to erect corporations is inherent in the very definition of government, and essential to every step of progress to be made by that of the United States, namely, that every power vested in a government is in its nature sovereign, and includes by force of the term a right to employ all the means requisite and fairly applicable to the attainment of the ends of such power. After the establishment of this national bank in 1790, 30 state-chartered commercial banks sprang up over the next 10 years, acting as nurseries of economic wealth, and, working in tandem with the national bank, formed a national banking system, creating the medium of exchange which could facilitate the growth of the federally directed economy. Our government does not need to gather up money like a beggar, but rather by the implied power of sovereign government with respect to its finances, and the explicit power of Article 1, Section 8's clause, to borrow money on the credit of the United States, it emits bills on the credit of the United States to the Treasury, which can then be turned into whatever serves the purpose of money for the economy. Money which Congress borrows, or debt it creates, is a bill of credit from the United States, which we say we will pay back, and in the meantime that bill of credit can be monetized by the Treasury. Then, by receiving these bills of credit from Congress, the Treasury uses the national bank to coordinate the distribution and allocation of this credit until the credit is made fungible through the development of the real economy, which occurs through the directed investments through the national banking system. This process creates a sovereign currency, which is a reflection of the nation's power to act, not something to be speculated upon. Debt is redefined, a creation by government through an emission of credit. A sovereign government does not go into debt to someone else. Rather, a government states its intention to carry out an action it deems necessary, and accounts for that action by an issuance of credit. The debt it creates will now be used to account for carrying out the purpose for which the credit was issued. There is no money involved in that process. Hamilton's revolution bluntly stated that money in exchange has no self-evident value outside that process and is only a means by which the credit of government is transferred. The power of the national banking system established the fact that we create value in the action to achieve a future state not yet in existence. The period of time in which these bills of credit end up being actualized into hard money, or something which can be accounted as money in circulation, as a physical representation in the form of infrastructure projects or applied technology, takes as much time as those items take to be built, and can be restrained in their allocation according as a practical estimation of a nation's power to create those items seems to justify. And nothing more can be actually presupposed than that there exist resources which, put into activity to the greatest advantage for the nature of the operation with the government, will be equal to the effect desired to be produced. Whenever the United States has followed these principles, we have prospered. That was true in the first years of our republic, up through the successful repulse of Britain's attack in 1812, and into the infrastructure building internal improvements of John Quincy Adams' presidency in the 1820s, and with the revival of American system economics by President Abraham Lincoln. At the time of our Civil War of 1861 to 1865, and by Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the Great Depression of the 1930s and the industrial mobilization to defeat fascism in World War II. Lincoln, with crucial help from Tsar Alexander II and the Russian Navy, defeated the British-supported Confederacy in the Civil War. Even after his assassination, the American system of infrastructure improvements and state-generated credit for productive investment flowered all over the world. In the United States, Henry Carey's American System Group promoted industrial development. Followers of Friedrich List's National System of Political Economy did the same under Bismarck in Germany. Japan's Meiji Restoration of 1868 brought American system economists into control of that country's economic development. In Russia, you had the collaboration of the universal genius Dmitry Mendeleev and a master of the national economy system, Count Sergei Witte, very effective opponents of the British imperial free trade system. The United States and Russia each moved to build the first ever transcontinental railways. We can understand the 4-decade drive by the British Empire to orchestrate the outbreak of World War I, including by breaking apart Germany and Russia and capturing Russia and France in the Triple Entente as the British Empire's response to the transformation of our planet through the creation of this new type of infrastructure platform for nation-state development, the Transcontinental Railroad. Witte's conception of the Trans-Siberian as a development corridor and the prospect that Germany would complete the Berlin to Baghdad Railway frightened the British imperial interests. They were about to lose their control over the world through finance and maritime trade. Their response was World War. Likewise today, to achieve post-crisis development of the world economy, it is necessary for citizens of every relevant country to politically remove the war party from power. And we must change the monetarist economic policy of wild financial speculation and aggressive looting of the physical economy, because that is the root cause of geopolitics and the danger of war. Here, to conclude our presentation of the principles of a credit system, we shall excerpt recent Larush Pack videos to demonstrate the needed application of the historical precedents we have cited, incorporating the following scientific ideas. Scientifically, a credit system is a system of principle consistent with the concept of the universe embodied in V.I. Vernadsky's noosphere, and not the mechanistic interactions imagined by Newton, Adam Smith, or Darwin. In a credit system, the future acts efficiently on the present. In society, this means building the types of social structures needed in order for a vision of the future to be able to act backwards from the future upon what the value of activity in the present is. Using a credit system for this science driver economy, we can create infrastructure platforms for the development of our planet's frontiers and move on to master the solar system and galactic processes. Russian-American cooperation has a crucial role to play in this process. A first step is the application worldwide of the American Glass-Steagall principle of a two-tier banking system. In Germany, it is called a Trennenbanken system. Named after a key Roosevelt-era law, Glass-Steagall means the separation and protection of state credit creation and normal commercial banking activity for productive investment against being dominated and poisoned by financial speculation. The Glass-Steagall policy will free governments from any obligation to honor debts incurred through financial speculation. This is necessary so that a system of long-term investment can create real physical wealth in the form of scientific and technological progress such as NWAPA and NASA represent. Governments can agree to shift to these principles, but Glass-Steagall is only the first step. A truly effective credit system, as Hamilton showed, orients to a future state not yet in existence. Where should we be in 50 years? Our post-crisis economic policy has to be driven by a concept of the frontiers of science to be conquered. Look at NWAPA and its implications.
These large-scale infrastructure projects will be headed up by, on the North American side, NWAPA, the North American Water and Power Alliance. And on the opposite side of the Pacific, a network of development projects connected to what is called the Eurasian Land Bridge, which would reach up through Russia, through Siberia, until these two projects connected at the Bering Strait. This would reopen a region of the world known as the Arctic for collaboration and economic development, and create the possibility for the generation of real, physical wealth globally. In this way, the policies represented by Glass-Steagall and by the implementation of a credit system allows us to link human society across time. Now, that linking across time allows us to now link human society in a completely new way across space. Take a look at the rail routes that are required in order to develop the NWAPA system. The NWAPA system will represent the conscious human taming of biological cycles, biospheric cycles of the planet. This is to take the existing cycles of evaporation off the ocean, in this case off the Pacific Ocean, and to take the existing cycles of cloud formation and rainfall and to shift them, taking the large quantities of water that now currently run off into the ocean from Alaska and northwestern Canada, and to rescue that fresh water from being lost as salt water, and to redirect it down to the North American continent in order to green the Great American Desert shared between the United States and Mexico, as well as to provide water and power for many areas of Canada and the United States which are currently suffering. But now this will require massive infrastructure development in the state of Alaska. For this massive investment into the dams, canals, and other water management that is required in Alaska, there will have to be constructed a network of rail transportation to connect the productive centers of the United States with those regions of potential development in Alaska. This brings a level of civilization to the northern portions of North America which has never been seen before in the history of the human species. The effect will be to have these regions leapfrog the existing developed areas of North America. We will be taking the most backwards regions and making them the most forward-looking regions. This level of infrastructure development now placed in Alaska gives us the ability to complete the Bering Strait crossing. When connected with a series of development projects which have already been proposed for Russia, Russia's Far East, and Siberia, this becomes an impressive worldwide network.
And where should we go from the Trans-Pacific and the Arctic? Look at just a few minutes of the Larush Pack video on the Arctic, a part of our series on Nawapa.
Why do we tolerate such poverty as we find in China and India today? Can the human species develop any further without improving the conditions of 2/3 of its people? What standards of living must we maintain worldwide to wield mankind's power? Developing these resources in Siberia, laying these rail connections, and raising new cities is the basis for establishing these standards. This potential cannot become a looting ground for empire. Rather, it gives us the opportunity to uplift humanity out of its miserable condition, if we choose to act freely in this way. And, if the United States were to lead the way, working with the nations of Russia, China, and India now, we could get started. Having set this process into motion, we can turn to some of the questions with deeper implications for the continued existence of man. The economic development of Alaska, building the Bering Strait Bridge, multiple hydroelectric dams, and numerous new nuclear-powered industrial cities needed to bring about and maintain these changes, puts us in a very interesting place. Combined with the economic development of Siberia by Russia, and the prospect of finally opening up northern Canada to development, the presence of man in this region creates capabilities which have never existed before. As was the case with the Tennessee Valley Authority, the economic development of these once backwards regions will allow them to leapfrog the rest of the world, becoming the most technologically advanced regions of the planet. Currently, isolated research stations exist in the Arctic, some of them floating on ice floes, others situated across many miles of snow. With the capabilities they gain from the effects of Nawapa, they will be in a position to answer some of the most important, outstanding questions about the nature of life, the biosphere, and the organization of our solar system. Our ability to act in the solar system and the galaxy is facilitated by a network which extends far out into Earth orbit and ultimately into interplanetary and interstellar space. This system, in order to be completed in a way to defend us against threats such as electromagnetic pulses from the sun and other galactic threats, such as whatever is responsible for the 62 million year periodicity of mass extinctions, this must be a collaboration between the three major powers of the US, Russia, and China to begin with. Only this kind of collaboration around constructing its extended sensorium will place mankind in its proper role and allow mankind to carry out its necessary extraterrestrial imperative. This invisible process of expanding, developing human creativity, human anti-entropy, is the actual principle which underlies the policy of Glass-Steagall, the implementation of a credit system, and the combined Arctic development between the US, China, and Russia. Properly understood, this principle of human creativity will represent a renaissance globally, and will represent a new era for the human species. The exit from our adolescence and into our adulthood.
A credit system, replacing the presently bankrupt, collapsing monetarist system, means, for example, that the new Vostochny Cosmodrome will be built and will succeed both as the core of a cluster for development of Russia's Far East and as a launching ground for manned space exploration and colonization. It means unlimited possibilities for U.S.-Russian cooperation on what Russia's ambassador to NATO, Dmitry Rogozin, recently proposed, the SDE, or Strategic Defense of the Earth project. Blocking the threat of nuclear war, the USA and Russia can work together against threats to Earth from nearby space, such as the recent asteroid flyby warned us about, as well as those posed by galactic and extragalactic processes. Trans-Pacific Center development, railroads and development corridors connected across the Bering Strait, the scientific mastery of the Arctic, the Moon, and of our solar system, and implementation of the SDE. Those are the prospects opened up by ending the permanent crisis of today's bankrupt monetarist policies and launching the credit system which the physical economy needs for a genuine post-crisis era. Благодарю вас за внимание.